Earlier I mentioned that one of the holy grails of distributed cloud applications is that of auto-scaling service instances, where the orchestrator can monitor the load, possibly with your help, to see, that is, you reporting certain things, to see how the service is doing. And if it's getting a lot of traffic, it can go and scale instances up, charging you more money. And if it's getting a little traffic, it can go and scale the instances down, thereby saving you money. There's really three techniques that are used for auto-scaling service instances, and we'll talk about them on this slide here. The first technique, which is a really great one, is periodically checking a queue length. In this example, I have two instances of a service running behind a queue. And we have clients, and we don't know how many clients there are, but they are publishing messages into the queue. Right now, the queue has two messages. And it could be that clients are publishing messages in, and these services are handling those messages. And so if that keeps happening over and over again, and so there's really no more than two messages in the queue at any time, that means we're doing pretty good. As messages are showing up, the service instances are processing them. However, it could be that more clients show up and they post more messages in the queue. So now the queue length is growing over time. And now we have some messages that are being backlogged in the queue. Now we have 5 of them. So you could have the orchestrator monitor this queue length periodically, right? It would check it periodically. And if it sees that the queue length has grown, the orchestrator could go and add some additional services into the cluster to start processing those messages more quickly so the queue length doesn't grow without bounds. Right? That's what we want to avoid. And of course, when it increases the nodes in the cluster, it's going to be costing you more money because you're typically paying hourly for these nodes, but now you're processing the workload in a more timely fashion. Then it could be that now you're processing the queue messages more quickly because you have 4 service instances processing them, then now the queue length will begin to shrink. And when that happens, the orchestrator can detect it and can shrink the number of virtual machines. So now we went from 4 down to 3. So now you're saving money because you're only paying hourly for these 3 virtual machines to process the load. So as I say here on the slide, the orchestrator is periodically checking the queue length. And if the queue length is growing, it will scale up the number of instances in your cluster. If it is shrinking, then it will scale down the number of instances. And if the queue length is relatively stable, then of course the number of instances will also remain stable. Another way to do this is not with queues, but to periodically check some kind of resource usage. So here I have a load balancer, and it is pushing client requests into service 1 or service 2. But each of these services has some kind of resource that's being monitored. Typically, this is something like memory consumption or CPU utilization or perhaps bandwidth utilization, or maybe it's hard disk space. Right? Those are the kinds of resources that you would monitor on these machines. Now what I'm showing is, imagine that each of the machines has some kind of meter on it, if you will. It's typically really just done with an integer, not something visual, but I've made it visual on the slide. And both of these are in the green, meaning we're not approaching some maximum resource utilization, like we're not approaching 100% CPU utilization. But if more client requests come into the load balancer, then if you watch the slide in the animations here, you'll see that one of these services may start approaching yellow, right? So it's starting to get high on CPU utilization. And maybe service instance 2, it starts approaching yellow as well. So when that happens, the orchestrator could see it and maybe go and introduce a 3rd service here. And when that happens, because now the load balancer is sending the traffic over 3 instances, the utilization goes out of the yellow and goes back into the green for these 3 instances. Right? And then if they started to approach yellow again, then again another instance could be introduced into the cluster. And you might have a low threshold here too, where if CPU drops below 10, 20% or something, the orchestrator could go and start removing some of these service instances, and you're still in the green on some of the other instances that remain. Right, so it works the same way as I mentioned before. In this case, instead of periodically checking queue length, where the orchestrator is periodically checking resource consumption or usage, and if the resource usage is going up, we scale the instances up. Resource usage going down, we scale them down. Resource usage stable, we keep the number of instances we have. So those are two ways. There is a third way of auto-scaling, and that's really based on a schedule. This could be done like during the daytime we want to have a lot of instances, but during nighttime we want to scale down, or maybe it's over weekends or weekdays we have different scale. Maybe on holidays we have a different amount of scale. But you have to be careful with this third way, because really you're predicting what the load is based on what you expect due to the time of day. Right? It's not really that you're scaling up or scaling down based on the actual load. It's really based on what you are predicting the load to be. And so you have to be careful with that. You have to make sure that you are estimating correctly. Otherwise, you might not scale up high enough, and then your client requests are being denied service or processing is very slow. The alternative is, you scale up too high and now you're paying extra money for instances that's really not giving you very much value. So that's really what the danger is of doing that. So as I mentioned at the bottom here, potentially dangerous as the actual load may be different from predicted.